The following lecture is by Rudolf Steiner from the 16th of November, 18th, 19th and 25th of November 1917, given in Dornach. You will have noticed something was said in yesterday's public lecture that is of great significance for the acquisition of spiritual knowledge within human life. I spoke of those of our contemporaries here on the physical plane who prefer to acquire ideas that derive only from the sense world, or which are gained through an intellect that is bound to the sense world. I indicated how, after death, human beings who do not wish to know of anything other than the sense world remain tied in a way to surroundings that still fall strongly within the earthly physical region in which the human being resides between birth and death. As a consequence, destructive forces are created within the physical world through such human beings who, owing to their life in the physical body, remain tied to the earthly physical world for a long time after death. In discussing such a matter, one touches on deep, profound secrets of human life, mysteries which for centuries, millennia one could say, have been carefully guarded by certain occult societies. These societies claimed, we will not examine today with what justification, that human beings were not mature enough to receive such truths, such secrets, which if they were to become known would cause great confusion. We have left to say today about the justification for withholding from human beings such deeply penetrating truths, so significant for life, and cultivating them only within the narrow circles of occult schools. It must be said, however, that the time has come when wider circles of humanity cannot and must not remain without communications of these secrets about the supersensible world, such as I mentioned yesterday. Indeed, public communication of these matters must be taken further and further. For even if it were appropriate, within certain limits, to withhold such secrets in earlier times when humanity lived under different conditions, that would no longer be justified now. As you know, we are in the 5th post-Atlantean epoch, and human beings are now subject to other life conditions, under which they will necessarily pass through the portal of death as forces of destruction if they do not increasingly search in this life for inner pictures, concepts and ideas concerning supersensible matters. We cannot maintain, therefore, that those people are justified who say, well, we can just wait and see what will happen after death. No, between birth and death, one needs to know about certain things concerning the spiritual world of the sort that were indicated yesterday in order to pass through the portal of death with these conceptions. In earlier periods of humanity's evolution, the situation was different. As you know, well into the 16th century, behind the emergence of the Copernican worldview, human beings held entirely other beliefs about the structure of the world. It was necessary, of course, for human progress and for the advance of human freedom within humanity's evolution that the Copernican worldview made its appearance, just as spiritual science would make its appearance now. But with the physical worldview that human beings held before Copernicanism, today one can call it correct if one so wishes, the view of the physical structure of the world according to which the earth stands still and the sun moves around the earth's heavens, the stars move around the earth, and beyond the starry heavens there exists a spiritual sphere inhabited by spiritual beings. With this worldview, human beings were still able to go through the portal of death without being held back in the earthly sphere as the deceased. This worldview did not yet cause human beings to become forces of destruction in the earthly sphere after passing through the portal of death. That only came about with the sudden emergence of Copernicanism, the idea of the whole world spread out in space and only subject to the laws of space. Only with Copernican views that allow for the earth to circle the sun are human beings bound to physical sensory existence and prevented from rising up to the spiritual world in the appropriate manner after death. Today one needs to become familiar with this other side of the Copernican worldview, now that for centuries human souls have been conditioned through having the magnificent progress of the Copernican worldview placed before them again and again. The one side is as justified as the other. Today the one is deemed a sign of intelligence, though it is in fact a narrow-minded intelligence that holds up the Copernican worldview as the one true teaching. Whereas the other, that, due to their Copernican worldview, human beings remain bound to the earth after death unless they acquire a spiritual conception, such as can be acquired within spiritual science today, is still considered foolishness and folly by people at present. Yet it is true nevertheless. As you know from the Bible, many a thing that is foolishness to human beings is wisdom for the gods. When human beings pass through the portal of death, they thereby alter the nature of their consciousness. It would be a completely false idea to believe that human beings lose consciousness after death. This peculiar idea is even prevalent among groups that call themselves theosophical. It is a nonsense, for on the contrary, consciousness becomes much more powerful, much more intense, but it is then of a different nature. Conscious ideas after death must be considered something else entirely, even when contrasted with our normal conceptions of the physical world. After death, the human being comes into contact with those people first and foremost with whom he is karmically linked during his life. In the spiritual world between death and a new birth, the deceased may encounter many human souls whom he penetrates, for the principle of penetrability rather than impenetrability applies there, while those whom he passes by, if I can use that expression, are not present there for him. Those who are present there for him are those with whom he has a karmic connection. Through our life on earth we need to grow into a general relationship between worlds, even after death. The founding of societies established on purely spiritual grounds has already become a task for humanity of the present and of the future. Why does one seek to establish societies such as the Anthroposophical Society? Why does one seek to unite people in a sense under such ideas? Because a karmic bond is thereby established between human beings who are meant to find each other in the spiritual world. They are meant to be together in the spiritual world, which is something they could not do if they wandered around cut off from one another here. By creating the opportunity for human beings to share and spread spiritual knowledge and wisdom, we achieve an enormous amount for life in the spiritual world. This then acts back on the physical, sense world, which is constantly under the influence of the spiritual world. What occurs here are only the effects, the causes of which arise over there in the spiritual world, including while we live here on the physical plane. And you could say that, if we merely consider what today are often run purely for propaganda purposes, associations are founded for everything possible. But truly very few are dedicated to spiritual matters, even if they are founded out of ever such great enthusiasm. Through many an association, people think they are able to gradually transform the world into an earthly paradise. Well, prior to these 3 years of war, there were numerous such associations founded on earth in which people worked towards gradually turning Europe into a social paradise. What exists now does not lend much credence to the belief that events will take their course according to how one thinks one is able to direct them. On the other hand, however, collaboration of the physical world with the spiritual world is even more complicated. Nevertheless, it must be said that if associations are founded in the light of spiritual science, people are working not only with the world of effects, but also with the world of causes, which lies behind the sensory effects. One needs to permeate oneself with this feeling if one wishes to understand correctly the infinitely deep significance of what is being achieved at present through living together in spiritual collaboration, and what will be achieved in this respect in the future of humanity. This is not something that can arise out of any mere clubby association, but a sacred task which was destined for humanity of the present and of the future by the heavenly spiritual beings who guide the world. For human beings will have to acquire certain ideas about the supersensible world, as ever fewer supersensible ideas will come from the sense world. You could say that supersensible ideas are increasingly being driven out due to the continued progress of natural science. Human beings would therefore gradually exclude themselves entirely from the spiritual world if they did not acquire any supersensible spiritual concepts. They would condemn themselves after death to uniting entirely with what is merely the physical earth, and also to uniting themselves with what the physical earth is destined to become. But the physical earth will become a corpse in future, and human beings as souls will be faced with the terrible prospect of condemning themselves to inhabiting a future corpse, unless they decide to familiarize themselves with the spiritual world and put down roots in the spiritual world. The pursuit of spiritual science has therefore been set as a serious and profound task. That is something we must call before our souls as a sacred thought once every day, as it were, so that we never lose our zeal for the justified endeavour of spiritual science. If we take part in everything that comes towards us as concepts, all the many concepts that have already entered our spiritual stream from the spiritual world, then these conceptions can be expanded further and further. They enable us to free ourselves from our bondage to the earthly realm and to what is destructive in the earthly realm, so that we can act from out of other perspective. We still remain united with the souls that we have left behind on earth and with whom we are karmically connected, as well as with the earth itself, but we are united with them from out of other regions. Indeed, we are even more intensively connected with the souls we have left behind on earth if we are united with them in a sense from out of higher regions, provided, that is, we are not condemned through having lived a purely materialistic life to haunt the earth, so to speak, where we cannot remain united through love with anything on earth, but instead can only really act as centres of destruction. You see, here we gradually develop our consciousness from childhood onwards, where we know how this consciousness grows and matures and need not say anything more. After death, entirely other processes prevail under which we must gradually acquire the consciousness that is required for life between death and a new birth. The way we go about our lives on earth, having experiences and learning things, that is not how it is after death. It is then no longer really necessary. What is necessary is that we detach ourselves from the extreme intensity of attachment that remains with us when we have departed our physical body. By passing through the portal of death and into a relationship with the spiritual world, we grow together with the same spiritual world that we describe here through spiritual science. We describe it as the world of the higher hierarchies, angeli, archangeli, archi, exousia, dynamis, hierarchies, and so on, as the world of the higher hierarchies and as the deeds and experiences of these hierarchies. Here the world is outside of us. We are surrounded by the mineral realm, the plant realm, and the animal realm. When we have passed through the portal of death, the spiritual beings that we count among the higher hierarchies are there in us. Indeed, their worlds are there in us. We are united with them. It is just that, initially, we are not able to distinguish ourselves from them. We live within them, in that they permeate us. Admittedly, this is a difficult concept, but it is one that needs to be grasped. Here we are outside of the world. There we are inside the world. Our being spreads itself over the whole world, yet we are unable to separate out and recognize ourselves. After death, we are filled completely, so to speak, with the being of the higher hierarchies and with what these hierarchies do. What is required is that we first separate out the next hierarchies that permeate us, the hierarchies of the angeli, archangeli, and archi from the higher hierarchies. Over there, we do not attain a proper I consciousness at all, if we are unable to find the power within us to distinguish. What in us is angelos? What in us is Elohim? What in us is a being from the hierarchy of the angeli? What in us is a being from the hierarchy of the exousia, the spirits of form? Over there we need to learn to distinguish. We need to have the power to detach ourselves from that with which we are united and from what it is that we wish to identify. Otherwise, it is in us and not external to us. Here we must come together with what is outside of us and observe it, while over there we need to detach ourselves in order that we can be united with it. Given the way the world is at the current stage of humanity's evolution, we can only detach ourselves from what is otherwise asleep in us by acquiring spiritual concepts, these spiritual concepts that are so uncomfortable for human beings here because they have to exert themselves a little, exert themselves more than is the case with ordinary concepts. If we acquire spiritual concepts then, after death, they develop into an enormous force through which we are able to recognize the spiritual world and comprehend it. This is very important. Today, human beings find the acquisition of spiritual concepts uncomfortable. They prefer to go to presentations where they are shown all kinds of photographs and whatever else exists of that sort, so that, as far as possible, they need not think beyond the sense realm. They only have to look at everything. Or, at any rate, they only like to go to lectures where they are told about things that they have in front of their eyes all the time anyway. Human beings today avoid expending the effort required to lift oneself up to such concepts, which are more difficult to grasp here because they do not have an external object. Their objects are the facts they refer to in the supersensible world. But over there, these concepts are the powers that show us the world as it is in reality. Thus we acquire the wisdom that we need through spiritual ideas and concepts in order to have a light over there, otherwise everything remains dark. What is acquired as wisdom here is light over there, spiritual light. Wisdom is spiritual light. Indeed, over there we need wisdom in order for it not to be dark. If we do not acquire any spiritual concepts, then that is simply the best means for ensuring that we do not have any light over there. And without light we move away from the sphere that we should be illuminating to arrive back on earth, where we wander around as the dead, as centres of destruction on earth. At most, one can then only be used now and again by a black magician in order to provide inspiration for very special deeds and destructive works on earth. Wisdom is therefore required so that one has light after death. But after death we need something else as well. In addition to the ability to separate ourselves from and distinguish the beings of the spiritual world, after death we also need the capacity for love. Otherwise we would not be able to develop the correct kind of relationships with the beings whom we are able to see through wisdom. We need love, but love that is developed here on earth is largely dependent on the physical body. It is a feeling which here in the physical world is dependent on the rhythm of breathing. We cannot take this love over with us into the spiritual world. At the present time, in particular, it would be a complete illusion to believe that we could take the love that we develop here over into the spiritual world. We do, however, take over into the spiritual world all the power of the love that we acquire here in the physical world through our sense-bound perspective, through life with our physical being. Love is kindled by what is developed here in the physical world as understanding and appreciation for this physical world. The experiences that develop into love over there are precisely the experiences gained through the worldview of modern natural science, provided one has these experiences as feelings. However, love is something that can be of a lower or higher nature depending on the domain in which it unfolds. If you pass through the portal of death and remain a centre of destruction in the earthly realm, then you will also have developed much love, for the fact that you remain on earth is precisely a consequence of your having united yourself with purely naturalistic concepts. However, you will use this love for works of destruction, which you will then come to love, and you will be condemned to observe yourself in your love of this destructive work. Love becomes something noble, on the other hand, if human beings can rise up into the higher worlds and love what they have mastered through spiritual concepts. Let us not forget, love is something that is base if it acts within a lower sphere, and something noble, lofty and spiritual if it acts within a higher or spiritual sphere. That is the essence of what matters. If we do not become conscious of this, then we will not understand things in the right way. It is concepts such as these, concerning the life of the human being after death, that individuals need to acquire for themselves today. It is no longer enough for present-day humanity, and it certainly will not be enough for humanity in the near future, that preachers tell people they should believe in this or that, or that they should prepare themselves for eternal life, if they are never able to tell people what the world actually looks like that human beings enter after they have passed through the portal of death. In earlier times it was still possible to do this because natural, scientific or naturalistic concepts did not yet exist, and because human beings had not yet been infected by mere material interests, which have gradually taken hold of everything since the 16th century. In earlier times it was possible to talk to people about the supersensible world in the way that religious faith still wish to do today. Today that is no longer effective, as human beings frequently entrap themselves, unfortunately it must be said out of deep compassion for humanity, precisely because they wish to promote their own eternal bliss in an egotistical manner through the religious creeds. They thereby entrap themselves more than ever in the physical sense realm, in the naturalistic world, and block their own ascendance after they have gone through the portal of death. They then experience something else entirely, which makes it a necessity to stress quite strongly that spiritual science must be pursued by humanity now and in the future because, it must be noted, those people who are unable to furnish themselves with any conceptions of life after death through spiritual science find themselves in a deplorable situation. Spiritual science is equally something that one must seek to spread among other human beings out of heartfelt concern, for the situation is wretched if people resist, and in their lack of understanding continue to resist, the emergence of spiritual scientific ideas. We must, however, be absolutely clear. The spiritual world is present everywhere. Just think, the world in which the dead are with the dead, this supersensible world, the links the dead establish with the living whom they have left behind, the links the dead establish with the higher hierarchies. This is all part of the world that we are standing in now. Just as it is true that the air surrounds us, so it is true that that world always surrounds us. We are not separated from that world at all. We are only separated from the world we enter after death through conditions of consciousness. It must be emphasized strongly, as even within our circles not all our friends are fully aware, that the dead find the living again completely. We only remain separated while the one is here within the physical body and the other is without a physical body. However, all the powers that bring us together with the dead, through our detaching ourselves from them, first need to be acquired. Otherwise the dead live in us and we cannot become aware of them. We must also carry over into the right sphere the power of love, which develops under naturalistic conceptions here, otherwise this power will become an evil force for us over there. It is love that develops under naturalistic conceptions, in particular that could otherwise become an evil force. A power as such is neither good nor bad. It can be the one or the other, depending on whether it is manifested in the one or other sphere. Just as we are connected with this supersensible world that the dead inhabit, so the supersensible world also projects in another way into the physical sense world. Indeed, the world is complicated, and understanding of it is something that needs to be acquired slowly and gradually, but one must have the will to acquire this understanding. The spiritual world projects into our world. Everything is permeated by the spiritual world. Everywhere within the sense world there is also a supersensible aspect. Human beings need to be especially interested in the particular supersensible aspect that relates to their own sensory nature. Now, I ask you to consider the following very carefully, as it is an exceedingly important conception. We human beings have body, soul and spirit as our constituent members, but that by no means completes our being. Our body, our soul and our spirit are in a sense what our consciousness is initially concerned with, but that is not everything that relates to our being, not at all. What I am going to say now concerns certain secrets of human becoming, of human nature, which need to become known today, and become ever more widely known in future. When the human being enters earthly existence through birth, he has, in that he has a physical body, not only the possibility to give his own soul its existence, but, I ask you to consider this well, the human being does not know everything about this physical body by any means. For there are all sorts of things going on in the physical body that the human knows nothing about. He only learns gradually, and in a rather deficient manner, through anatomy and physiology, what goes on in this body. If we had to wait with feeding ourselves until we had understood the process of nutrition, we could not even claim that human beings would starve, for it is not even conceivable that one could know something about what the organs do in preparing nourishment for the organism. The human being thus arrives into this world with his organism in which he clothes himself, without reaching down into this organism with his soul. There is, however, an opportunity, shortly before we are born, not long at all before we are born, for another spiritual being, in addition to our soul, to take ownership of our physical body, of the subconscious part of our body. It is just the fact that, shortly before we are born, we are permeated by another being, whom, in our current terminology, we would call an Ahrimanic spiritual being. This being is as much within us as our own soul is within us. Such beings live their lives by using the human being in order to be present within the sphere in which they wish to be. They have an extraordinarily high level of intelligence and a very highly developed will, but nothing in the nature of a life of feeling, not what we would call a human life of feeling. And so it is indeed the case that we go through our lives with a soul and this doppelganger, who is cleverer, far cleverer than we are. This being is highly intelligent, but possesses a Mephistophelian intelligence, an Ahrimanic intelligence, as well as a very strong will, a will that is much closer to the forces of nature than our human will, which is tempered by our life of feeling. In the 19th century, natural science discovered that the nervous system is permeated by electrical forces, and natural science was right about that. However, if science holds, or scientists believe, that our nerve forces, which belong to us and provide a basis for our life of thought, have anything to do with electrical currents passing through our nerves, then they are mistaken. For the electrical currents are the forces placed into our being by that other being who I have just described, and do not belong to our being at all. We do also carry electrical currents within us, but they are of a purely Ahrimanic nature. These beings of high intelligence, but of purely Mephistophelian intelligence, and who possess a will that is closer to nature than what can be said of the human will, decided at a certain point, out of their own volition, that they did not want to live in the world to which they had been assigned by the wisdom-filled gods of the upper hierarchy. They wanted to conquer the earth, for which purpose they require bodies, as they do not have bodies of their own. They therefore use as much of the human body as they can, as the human soul is not able to fill the human body completely. Because of the way the human body develops, these beings are thus able to enter into the human body in a certain way at a particular time before the human being is born, and then accompany us below the threshold of our consciousness. There is only one thing in human life that they absolutely cannot endure. They cannot endure death. They must therefore always leave the human body in which they establish themselves before it succumbs to death. Time and again this is a very bitter disappointment for them, as what they seek to appropriate for themselves is precisely the ability to remain in human bodies after death. That would constitute a great accomplishment in the realm of these beings, an accomplishment that they have not achieved as yet. If the mystery of Golgotha had not occurred, and if the Christ had not gone through the mystery of Golgotha, it would long since have been the case on earth that these beings would have seized the opportunity to remain within the human being at the time when the death of the human being is karmically predetermined. Then they would have secured a complete victory over human evolution on earth, and would have become the masters of human evolution on earth. It is of tremendously deep significance that we appreciate these connections between the Christ passing through the mystery of Golgotha and these beings who wish to conquer death in a human nature but who at present are unable to endure that death. These beings must always be on their guard so that they avoid experiencing within the human body the hour of death predetermined by the human being, avoid maintaining his body after the hour of death and extending the life of his body beyond the hour of death. What I am speaking about now has also long since been known to certain occult brotherhoods. They are very familiar with these things and have withheld them from humanity. Today the situation is such that it is impossible not to gradually equip human beings with the concepts they need once they have passed through the portal of death. Everything the human being experiences here, including what he experiences below the threshold of consciousness, he needs again after death. That is because he has to look back on this life, which needs to be completely comprehensible to him in retrospect. It is the most awful thing for him if he is unable to do this. One lacks an adequate grasp of things to understand this life in retrospect if one is unable to shed light on a being that plays such a large part in our life as this Ahrimanic being, a being who seizes ownership of us before our birth, and who is always there and will always prefigure in us, in our subconsciousness, if we do not continuously shed light on this. For wisdom becomes light after death. These beings are generally very important for human life, and knowledge of them must gradually be grasped by human beings and will be grasped by human beings. Only knowledge of them must be grasped by people in the right way. It must not just be spread within humanity by occult brotherhoods who turn it into a question of power, intending thereby to increase their own power. Above all, it must not be kept secret any longer for the purpose of increasing the power of certain brotherhoods acting out of egoism. Humanity is striving for universal knowledge, and such knowledge must be allowed to spread. It can no longer be beneficial in future for occult brotherhoods to use such things in order to increase their own power. Knowledge of these beings must increasingly be grasped by human beings over the next few centuries. Human beings will have to become increasingly aware over the next few centuries that they bear within themselves such a doppelganger, such an Ahrimanic, Mephistophelian doppelganger. Human beings need to know this. Today, people have already acquired quite a number of concepts, but these are in fact blind concepts, as people do not yet really know what to make of them. I am saying that people are developing concepts today that can only be given a sound basis if they are brought together with the facts that underlie them. And here something is opening up that must really be further pursued in future if humanity is not to undergo an endlessly impeding and endlessly horrifying experience. This doppelganger of whom I have spoken is nothing more or less than the originator of all physical illnesses that arise spontaneously from within us, and knowing him fully is organic medicine. Illnesses that arise spontaneously in the human being, not through external injuries, but spontaneously from within, do not originate in the human soul, but derive from this being. He is the originator of all illnesses that emerge spontaneously from within. He is the originator of all organic illnesses. And a brother of his, who is not Ahrimanic but luciferic in nature, is the originator of all neuroasthenic and neurotic illnesses, all illnesses that are in fact not illnesses but just, as they are described, nervous disorders, hysterical disorders, and so on. Medical science must therefore become spiritual in two directions. That this is required can be seen from the inroads made by approaches such as psychoanalysts and the like, which, although they deal with spiritual entities, do so with inadequate means of knowledge. The upshot is that one is unable to make any sense of the phenomena that will increasingly intrude into human life. Of course, certain things must occur out of necessity, and even that which is damaging in one respect must happen, because the human being must be exposed to what is harmful in order to overcome it, and thereby gain strength. In order to fully understand these matters I have just described, that this doppelganger is the real cause of all illnesses which have an organic basis, and which are not just functional, one needs to know a great deal more. One needs to know, for example, that our entire Earth is not a dead, finished product, as mineralogy and geology believe it to be today, but a living being. Mineralogy and geology know as much about the Earth as one would know about the human being if one were only familiar with the skeletal system. Imagine that you were never able to perceive human beings through any of your senses, but instead you had X-ray images of them. If your knowledge of people more familiar to you thus only ever extended to their skeletal systems, then you would know as much about human beings as geologists and science in general knows about the Earth. Imagine you entered into this room, and of all the esteemed ladies and gentlemen you find assembled here, you saw nothing other than their bones. Then you would have about as much awareness of all those present here as science has of the Earth today. The Earth, which is therefore only known as a skeletal system, is a living organism. As a living organism, it has an influence on the beings that wander around on it, namely on human beings themselves. And just as human beings are differentiated with respect to the distribution of their organs within their bodies, so the Earth is also differentiated with respect to what it develops out of itself and with which it influences the human beings who wander around on it. I'm sure you are aware that when you think, you do not exert a particular effort with your right index finger or your left big toe, but with your head. You know for certain that you do not think with your right big toe, you think with your head. Things are thus variously distributed within the living organism, which is differentiated. In the same way, our Earth is also differentiated. Our Earth is certainly not a being that radiates up the same thing to all its inhabitants. Instead, in different regions of the Earth, very different things radiate up. There are different types of forces, magnetic and electrical, but also forces that rise up to a much greater extent into the living realm out of the Earth, and which influence human beings in the most varied of ways at different points on the Earth. These forces influence human beings in different ways depending on geographical formations. This is a very important fact, as what initially constitutes the human being, body, soul and spirit, actually has little in the way of a direct relationship with these forces rising up from the Earth. But the doppelganger, whom I spoke about, is in a direct relationship with these forces streaming up from out of the Earth. And indirectly, by way of the doppelganger, who fosters a most intimate relationship with what streams up, human beings, as body, soul and spirit, are in a relationship with the Earth and with what the Earth radiates out at the various points. These Ahrimanic, Mephistophelian beings, who take ownership of the human being a short time before he is born, have their own very particular natural preferences. There are those beings who particularly like the Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, Asia and Africa, and who choose to use the bodies of human beings who are born there. Others choose bodies for themselves that are born in the Western Hemisphere, in America. What we human beings have as geography is but a faint reflection of what for these beings is a living principle of their own experiencing. It is how they choose their place of residence. From this you can also see that it will be one of the most important tasks of the future to cultivate again what has been split apart, geographical medicine, medical geography. With Paracelsus it was taken out of the old atavistic wisdom and split apart. Since then it has gradually been pursued due to people's materialistic views. It will have to find its place again. Many things will only be understood once people acquire knowledge of the relationship between the illness-inducing being within the human being and the Earth's geography, with all that merges together and all that radiates out of the Earth in its different regions. It is important, therefore, that human beings become acquainted with these matters, as their lives depend on it. After all, human beings are placed into earthly existence in a particular way through this doppelganger who has his dwelling within them, within human beings themselves. All All of this only really became immensely significant in the 5th post-Atlantean period and will become especially important for humanity in the very near future. That is also why knowledge of spiritual science must be spread now. It is especially important now because the present time calls for human beings to come to terms and engage deliberately with these things in a conscious manner. Human beings must become strong in our epoch so that they can order their existence with these beings. The present epoch commenced in the 15th century, when our current period began in 1413. The 4th post-Atlantean period, the Greco-Roman period, began in 747 prior to the mystery of Golgotha and lasted until 1413. Since that time, we've been living in the 5th post-Atlantean period, which is only gradually bringing its particular characteristics fully to the fore in our time, although these have been in preparation since the 15th century. In the 4th post-Atlantean period, it was primarily the intellectual or mind soul that developed. Now it is the consciousness soul that is developing within the overall evolution of humanity. When human beings entered the present period, their particular weakness in the face of this doppelganger had to be taken into consideration by the guiding spiritual beings. If human beings had taken into their consciousness much of all of what is related to this doppelganger being, then things would have gone badly for human beings, very badly. Even during the centuries leading up to the 14th century, human beings had to be protected in advance so that they should take in as little as possible of anything that was reminiscent in any way of this doppelganger. That is also how knowledge of this doppelganger, which was certainly there in earlier times, was lost. Human beings had to be prevented from taking in anything, not just from acquiring theoretical knowledge of the doppelganger, but also prevented as far as possible from coming into contact with anything that has to do with this doppelganger. To that end, a very special arrangement was required. You must try to understand what took place at that time. In the centuries leading up to the 14th century, human beings had to be protected from the doppelganger. He had to fade from their consciousness and was only gradually allowed to re-emerge in the present, now that human beings are called upon to order their relationship with him. This really required quite a considerable arrangement, which could only be achieved in the following way. Gradually, since the 9th and 10th century, conditions in Europe were so arranged that the European people lost a certain connection they had had earlier, a connection that had still been important for the people of the 7th and 6th centuries AD. What took place was that starting in the 9th century, and then continually, particularly markedly from the 12th century onwards, the entire shipping traffic over to America was stopped, as it was at the time with the type of ships that people had then. This may sound strange to you. You will no doubt say that you never learnt about anything like this in history. Well, history is in many respects a fable convenue, a legend. In earlier centuries of European evolution, ships had already sailed from Norway of that time, over to America. It was not called America, of course, as it had a different name then. People knew that America was the region where those particular magnetic forces rise up that bring the human being into a relationship with the doppelganger. The clearest relationships with the doppelganger emerge from that area of the earth that is covered by the American continent. And in earlier centuries, people sailed over to America in Norwegian ships and studied illnesses over there. In a sense, Europeans studied the illnesses caused by the Earth's magnetism over in America. It is there that the mysterious origin of the older European medicine is to be found. In America, where people were more sensitive to the influence of the doppelganger, one could observe the course of illnesses which one could not do in Europe. Gradually, however, one had to let the connection with America fall into oblivion. This was essentially brought about by the Roman Catholic Church through its edicts. Only after the 5th post-Atlantean period had commenced was America discovered again in a physical sense perceptible way. But it was just a rediscovery, albeit a significant one, because the powers that were at work actually brought it about that nowhere in the documents is there anything much reported about the older relationships Europe had with America. And where it is reported, one does not recognize it as such. One does not know that what is being referred to is the relationship between Europe and America in earlier times. The visits were, however, largely just visits, that the Europeans themselves then became the American people, as one says today, where the expression a people is misleadingly confused with nation, was only possible after the physical discovery, the physical rediscovery of America. Earlier, visits were mainly made to study the very special role played by the Doppelganger in the distinct nature of the American Indian race. For a period before the beginning of the fifth post-Atlantean age, Europe had to be protected from influences emanating from the Western world, and that is the significant historical expedient, the important historical arrangement which was cultivated by the wisdom-filled world powers. Europe had to be protected for a while from all these influences, and it could not have been protected if one had not closed the European world off in the centuries leading up to the 15th century, completely closed it off from the American world. A lot of effort had to be exerted for a period in the centuries of preparation to instill something into the European people that took into account their more subtle sensitivity. One could say that the intellect, which was to take centre stage in the fifth post-Atlantean period, had to be carefully protected during its initial emergence. What had to be revealed to this intellect needed to be presented to it in an especially subtle way. Sometimes this subtlety was similar to the subtlety in education, where sound punishments are, of course, also meted out. But all of what I mean here obviously refers to greater historical impulses. And so it came about that it was Irish monks who, under the influence of the pure Christian esoteric teaching that was developing in Ireland, acted in such a way that Rome saw it necessary to close Europe off from the Western Hemisphere. For this movement wanted to go forth from Ireland, spreading Christianity throughout Europe in these centuries prior to the fifth post-Atlantean period, without any interference from what was rising up from the subterranean realm of the earth in the Western Hemisphere. Europe was to be kept in the dark about all the influences on the western half of the globe. It seems appropriate at this point to speak about these circumstances which relate to Columbanus and his pupil St. Gall. They were important individualities in the great missionary quest that sought to Christianize Europe by surrounding it with spiritual walls, so to speak, and by not permitting any influence to enter from the direction that I indicated. Individualities like Columbanus and his pupil St. Gall, who founded and gave this place here its name, realized first and foremost that the tender shoots of Christianization could only be spread by surrounding Europe with a fence in spiritual terms. Indeed, behind the events of world history, there are deep, profound secrets. The history that is taught and learnt in schools, on the other hand, is frequently just a fable convenue. One of the most important facts required for an understanding of the modern period in Europe is what began in the centuries during which Christianity was spreading from Ireland and lasted up until the 12th century. Efforts were undertaken through papal edicts at this time that gradually proscribed and suspended all travel by ship between Europe and America, so that the connections with America were completely forgotten by Europe. This forgetting was necessary so that during the initial period in which the fifth post-Atlantean age was to be prepared in Europe, developments could unfold in the right way. It was only after the materialistic age had begun that America was rediscovered again to the West in the way that history tells us today. America was discovered from the East under the influence of the greed for gold, under the influence of a purely materialistic culture, the culture human beings are faced with in the fifth post-Atlantean period, and with which they are required to establish an appropriate relationship. These are matters of real history which I believe also help to clarify what really is the case. The earth really is something that should be called a living being. As a result of geographical differentiation, different forces stream up in the various territories. For this reason, human beings should not be separated into territories, but should accept from one another what is good and great in each territory and what can only be produced there in particular. That is why a spiritual scientific worldview seeks to create something that can truly be accepted by all nations and regions. Human beings must make forward strides in sharing their spiritual goods. This is what matters. Over and against this, however, individual territories are quick to produce the desire for power, more power and yet more power. The great danger that the evolution of modern humanity will progress in a one-sided way can only be evaluated on the basis of concrete, truly concrete circumstances if one knows that the earth is an organism, if one knows that what actually occurs emanates from the various points on earth. In Eastern Europe there is, comparatively speaking, less of this inclination purely through what streams out of the earth. The nature of Russianness, for example, is intimately related to the soil, but the Russian takes very special forces out of the ground, forces that do not come from the earth. The secret of Russian geography lies therein that the Russians take up from the earth what was first imparted as light to the earth, which is then returned by the earth. In other words, the Russians take up from the earth what streams from the outer regions to the earth. The Russians love their earth, but they do so because it is a mirror for them of the heavens. Therefore, however territorially minded the Russians may be, they have in their territorial disposition something which, although still at a childlike stage today, is extraordinarily cosmopolitan, for as the earth moves through space it comes into contact with all the possible parties surrounding it. Furthermore, if you take up into your soul not what streams from below to above, but what streams from above to below and back up again, then what you are taking in differs from what streams directly from the earth into a certain relationship with human nature. What the Russians love about their earth, what permeates them, gives them many weaknesses, but also, above all, a certain ability to overcome the doppelganger nature that I've just been speaking to you about. That is why they will be called upon to provide the most important impulses in the age in which this doppelganger nature will have to be combated and overcome in the 6th post-Atlantean cultural period. There is, however, a certain portion of the Earth's surface where there is the greatest kinship with these forces. If an individual moves there, he enters into the domain of these forces. As soon as he leaves there, that is then no longer the case. After all, these are geographical, not ethnographic or national, but purely geographical matters. There is a region where what streams up from below has the greatest influence on the doppelganger, and where, because the doppelganger enters into the greatest kinship with it, it is then imparted back to the earth. This is the region of the earth where most of the mountain ranges do not run from west to east in the crosswise direction, but from north to south, where the magnetic North Pole is closest, for that is also associated with these forces. That is the region where, first and foremost, a kinship develops with the Mephistophelian Ahrimanic nature as a result of outer conditions. And much will be brought about through this kinship in the onward progress of the Earth's evolution. Human beings today must not proceed blindly with the Earth's evolution. They need to be able to see through and comprehend these conditions. A Europe will only be able to enter into a correct relationship with America when such conditions are understood and when one knows what geographically determined effects come from there. Otherwise, if Europe continues to remain blind to these things, this poorer Europe will fare the same as Greece fared in relation to Rome. This must not be allowed to happen. The world must not be Americanized geographically. First, however, this needs to be understood. What occurs must not be taken with such a lack of seriousness as is often the case today. For you see, matters arise for deep reasons, and knowledge is necessary today, not just sympathies and antipathies in order to obtain a view on the situation in which present-day humanity finds itself so tragically placed. These are things that we are able to discuss here in more detail. They can only be hinted at in public lectures. Yesterday I pointed out how necessary it is for what we call spiritual science to push through into social and political concepts. For America strives to mechanize everything, drive everything into the area of pure naturalism, and gradually wipe Europe's culture from the surface of the earth. It cannot do otherwise. These are geographical concepts, of course, not concepts that pertain to a people. One only has to think of Emerson to know that nothing is intended here in terms of the characteristics of a people. Emerson, however, was a person whose education was European through and through. Obviously, we are talking about two opposite poles that are developing. Precisely under such influences as we have characterized today, people like Emerson developed by opposing the doppelganger with their full humanity. On the other hand, people like Woodrow Wilson develop, who are merely an outer shell for the doppelganger. Through them, the doppelganger acts particularly strongly, and they are essentially just embodiments of the American geographical nature. These things have nothing to do with any kind of sympathy or antipathy, or any kind of partisan prejudice. They only relate to insights into the deeper reasons for what human beings are living through. Very little will be achieved towards the salvation of humanity if human beings do not enlighten themselves about what is really at work within the issues. Today it is necessary again to restore the links with many things that were severed at the turning point in history when the route to America was blocked. And, as a symbol, I would like to place before you what you are able to feel and experience here in many ways. Human beings such as St. Gall. They to prepare the ground for their work by means of the fence they set up. One needs to understand such things. Spiritual science alone will enable real historical understanding, but, as you can see, prejudice upon prejudice will naturally arise against it. For how could one think otherwise than that knowledge will also become partisan? That is one of the reasons, which are actually reasons of cowardice, why certain occult brotherhoods have held these things back. They held back for the simple reason that these insights are frequently uncomfortable for people who do not want to become universally human. This applies especially to those who have the inclination to unite themselves with what streams out geographically.